Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you if you happen to be new here today. What's up to all the rest of y'all? Thanks to whoever is listening. How are we feeling? Me, I am feeling a million times better, I'm glad to say. If you were here last week, was not doing very well. And I'm happy to report I feel fully recovered, and we just had a much better week than last. I was praying for some kind of reprieve, and those prayers were answered, honestly. And thanks to those of you who sent me those notes about my daughter. You know who you are, and it's such a beautiful, beautiful thing to know that there are those of you out there who are listening and would care and would send your experiences and good wishes my way. So thank you so much. I do feel better, and I'm grateful. It's amazing how when sickness removes so much from what your life normally is, and when you get well again and you come back to the things that weren't happening, you see them in a different way. Everything felt a little bit more precious and important, and I'm grateful for that. I do hope that you are doing okay. Sure seems like challenges continue to abound, and I know firsthand how severe life can get sometimes. I hope that you've been enjoying these talks. That's what I've been doing. It certainly gives me something to put my attention on that feels, I don't know, like it fills me with that sense of curiosity that helps me feel alive, that activates life force, right? We're using life force now. Have you noticed? A lot more people have been using life force, including today's guest, Leslie Kaminoff, which you will hear. I'm so glad that I recorded this conversation with Leslie. It's been too long. He's a old and dear friend, and it was so good to touch base with him. And we got into some really cool stuff. Leslie listens to the show clearly, and so he knows what I've been talking about and some of the stuff that I've been into. And he went there with me, and I was just to be with an old friend and to connect on the stuff that we share in common. That's what this show is really about. It's why I started doing it from the beginning, and as I've been mentioning, it does feel like we've hit some kind of cycle. The 7-year anniversary approaches, I think, in like another month or so, another month or two. And it feels like we've come into some full cycle with the show. And this episode really felt like that. Celebrated in this reconnection. So cool to have had this chance to talk with Leslie again, and really a true joy for me to share it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, I do not want to forget to express our gratitude to Podcast Premium subscribers. Today I specifically want to shout out Karina Clark and Nancy Weinberger. What's up, Karina and Nancy? Thank you so much for supporting the show with your Podcast Premium subscriptions. Folks who are newer around here, if you have been enjoying what you're hearing on the show and you want to support it, or you want to get access to the full archives, which is pretty extensive at this point, the way to do it is become a Podcast Premium subscriber. It's choose your rate, cancel at any time. If you don't have money, you just send us an email and we will totally give you a free account. No questions asked. But if you've got a little something to give, it makes a difference. And we're very grateful to everybody who's doing it. To learn more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber or find all my stuff, I've got ongoing weekly classes you can partake in. I've got weekly discussions you can get in on. All of my stuff, everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, we're keeping it brief because, Leslie and I went on for a while, as old friends often do. So we'll leave it here for now. I will touch base with you on the other side for a moment, but let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Leslie Kaminoff. Hello?
Hey, Jay.
Leslie.
Hey, man.
Hey, Leslie.
Good to see your face.
And yours.
Hey, some shit's gone down since 2017 when I was last on the show, huh?
I just looked too. I just looked too to see when that was. I am already recording. I don't want to have to edit stuff out later, so don't say anything.
No, I know. I know you're.
You know the protocol. You listen.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny. I just looked too, and I was looking at your first time you were here was in 2016. I think it was like the 11th episode or something. A couple of months in.
It was, yeah. Amy was the second, and I think you just did another one with her, right?
Yes. I just talked with her. We talked about the third edition. I want to hear from you on it too.
Sure.
But I was looking back and I remember we didn't hook up and then you were like a couple months in, but then the last time you were here was like that final event at the Breathing Project.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Which was a crazy time for me because I was letting go of my center and moving and stuff. It was a crazy moment. Then 5 years has passed. What happened to the 5 years?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you ask us. In preparation for this, I actually, so much has gone down that I just had to make a list to remind myself of the dates and everything else that has happened. So I'm sure we'll get to talk about some of that.
Yeah. And I love it. I can see that you're in your same office, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Well, actually, this is my... You're seeing the same stuff hanging on the wall that was in my old office.
Oh my gosh, it looks very similar to your old office, actually, but it's not. Yeah. Are you in Vermont?
No. And you're probably thinking of Cape Cod, which is where we spent a lot of the quarantine with Lydia and I at the house that she owns with her sister. So that's kind of where we sequestered ourselves when the COVID hit the fan. But I'm currently at 94th and Broadway, which is my office and apartment that I rent right across the street from Lydia's place. So we have our own spaces. Yeah.
I see. So you've worked out of there for a while then too. That's always been a space you've had to work out of also.
Well, not always, but this particular space I rented in the fall of 2020. When landlord panic was at its peak and the rents were actually momentarily somewhat negotiable.
Yeah.
So I kind of lucked out that I was able to get it for, less than they were asking. And I was able to start up my practice again here just a little over a year ago, once I was fully vaccinated and, it felt safe to start working with people again, which I had not done for well over a year at that point, which was the longest period in my entire professional life that I hadn't done individual work with people. It was sort of a big piece of me that wasn't happening. And that was kind of interesting. So it was good to get back.
That's what I remember when I had my class at the Breathing Project space before that final event. You always had your office and you had your sessions and people waiting for you out in the hall. That was like your main gig.
It was for many, many years. That was how I supported myself and my family and, the dogs and horses and various other critters. Just pretty much seeing as many people as I could in a day, as many days a week as I could. And That was before the book came out in 2007. And then Amy and I both became more sort of in demand to be traveling teachers, and, you know, how that life is.
Well, that's
firsthand.
what happened in the first 3 years of the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And it's, I want to say, and I've said it on the show many times, and so you've heard it before, but I say it again because you're actually here, that you were without a doubt a person for me who was a modeling possibilities for me in terms of like whatever career trajectories were available to somebody who wasn't affiliated with a big institution or lineage or something. And I want to say also to you, and we can get to this later, you know, I'm doing this training, and I said this to Amy too. And part of that process for me, because I sort of swore them off for a lot of years after that last time I saw you in 2017.
No, I was interested to see that you decided to go back and do a training.
I did, but I'm doing it very differently than I was doing it in the past. And part of that has been like a reevaluation of what I was doing in the name of teacher training before and what I thought I wanted to do now. And part of that was really assessing like, what were the things that I learned and from who have held true, you know, through all of it, you know what I mean? All the sort of paradigm shiftings that have been happening. What are the like actual teaching techniques and ideas that have really held true? And things that I learned from you are like high on that list.
Oh, that's sweet. Well, that's nice to hear.
So, you know, some of those things I'm interested to revisit today, like in terms of like process of healing and how practice plays into that. But first, I want to stick with where we were, which is the traveling teacher trainer thing, because I was following you some in that because there was a circuit. There was like, especially internationally, where like the markets hadn't crashed as much, like in New York. And it was interesting to me to sort of see how even before the pandemic, you could kind of see that things weren't going great. Like that third visit to the place when the numbers would slump.
Yeah. No, we were definitely aware of that dynamic from the beginning. You'll recall that I was actually working for quite a while with Ava Taylor, Yama Talent, and she was doing all of our bookings for a while, and then just the international ones once Lydia took over the domestic stuff. But we would have weekly meetings and have the discussions about the state of the industry, for lack of a better term, in general. And since she had a bunch of other sort of traveling teaching clients, she really had her finger on the pulse quite well. And yeah, we saw the writing on the wall way before COVID, and also just this idea of not wearing out your welcome. Like we would try to have a minimum gap of 18 months, not a year, but 18 months between visits to the same place to not wear out your welcome. And we did try to maintain that. Like Australia was like every 2 years for us. And that seemed to work until it didn't. And it was in Australia in the spring of 2020 that I got COVID. I came back quite sick. I landed back here on March 10th, a few days before my 62nd birthday, having spent not just a 15-hour layover in Hong Kong, but almost as many hours on the flight home trying not to cough. If there's anything worse than coughing with COVID, is trying not to cough with COVID. Because I didn't want to be that guy on the airplane at that point in history, you know. I mean,
that was so early on in March 2020.
Yeah, I got at the same time.
We didn't have a clue about anything.
Sydney. Yeah, well, we didn't. You see, that's the thing. We knew it was out there in the world, but no one down under thought it had hit there yet. And so we were in a room. The last gig was in Sydney, and there was like 70 people in the room, and no masks, no distancing, no precautions at all. And that's pretty clear where I got it. Lydia was almost certainly exposed the same way I was, although she's never gotten sick, even though we know she was exposed there, and then she was exposed to me when I was sick and all that. She may be one of these people that just can't get it, even though she's the most cautious person I know about it. But yeah, it was It was brutal. It was brutal. And after quarantining in New York, we just headed to Cape Cod and spent most of 2020 there. And then I realized only after a while of hearing that there was such a thing as long COVID, that's what I had. And we just jumped out of the touring teaching conversation to COVID. Sorry, but that was sort of
that's where it leads for you. I knew that you had gotten it, but I didn't know you had been experiencing long extended symptoms.
Oh, sure. My heart, especially. I have a familial tendency toward AFib. My brother has had to deal with it, and other family members have had heart issues. And prior to COVID, I would sort of go in and out of AFib, atrial fibrillation. And I was always able to kind of sleep it off or hydrate and, get over it. But after I got COVID, I would go into AFib and I couldn't get out of it. And so I had to have 2 cardioversion procedures. That's where they shock you back into sinus rhythm. They knock you out first and then they shock you. And that sucked. And then once we started looking at the possibility of traveling again, I was like, I can't risk this happening when I'm out of town and having to teach, because, some people can walk around in AFib all the time, and that's just what they do. They take blood thinners to reduce their risk of stroke or whatever, but they kind of live in AFib because it doesn't affect them symptomatically that badly.
My sister-in-law has it some, but she doesn't have much symptoms. It's very functional.
Yeah. But I get quite symptomatic when I'm in AFib. I can't function very well. So I finally bit the bullet last September and had an ablation procedure here in New York, where they go in through a catheter in the groin and up into the heart and poke around and find the little nodes that are misfiring. And I was intubated for about 6 hours for that procedure, and they found 2 sites. The pulmonary vein is where the AFib was coming from. Then I had another arrhythmia that was arising from the tricuspid valve, and they had to ablate that. But I woke up in recovery and looked at the EKG, and it was just perfect. It was like a metronome, which it had not been. So it's like magic, really, that they can go in and basically, retune your heart.
So wait a second.
That.
What do they do when they put the thing in there? When you say retune, is it like an electrical shock, or what are they doing to your heart?
The shock thing is the cardioversion. That's almost like what you see on the medical dramas where they code someone and they bring in the
clear,
defibrillator.
and then
Yeah. It's sort of like that. No, this is from the inside. They're actually inside the heart. And they go in through the pulmonary vein and, through the groin, and they don't have to crack your chest. But the ablation, it's sort of like you're singeing almost.
So it's heat?
And it kind of puts insulation around certain specific nerve fibers that are misfiring in the heart. It's very much a try this and wait and see how the heart responds procedure, which is why it can take so long. But it's like science fiction. When you go in the lab, it's the equipment that they use.
It's like that movie where they were traveling inside the body or whatever.
To me, that's as close as I'll ever get to like having Dr. McCoy just wave a tricorder or something over me and fix me on Star Trek. Right? It was really high tech.
Wow. So when did that procedure happen?
That was September of last year. And it was talk about the 3rd edition, just to tie that string into it. The very, very last drop dead deadline of fixing some of the things that needed to be fixed for the 3rd edition of Yoga Anatomy was happening the evening before the morning I went into the hospital to get this procedure. And there were some significant things that needed to be fixed with illustrations and captions and making sure they were right and all of that. And so it went really down to the wire last fall.
That's the whole history of that book, though, isn't it?
It certainly is. We Amy and I think I'm speaking for her a little bit here, enjoy being authors, but loathe being writers. And those are two entirely different things. Mm-hmm. The author is the thing you get to do when you're writing your name in the book after it's out. The writing part is writing the damn thing. And, I thought that, hey, quarantine, COVID, nothing else is happening. We're on this deadline for the book in the summer of 2020. This is perfect. These are perfect conditions for just focusing on getting the book done. But it turns out, for me at least, it wasn't perfect, because I was dealing with brain fog and extreme fatigue and all of the stuff you hear about with the long COVID. And so it was kind of a struggle to get the work done, but I'm very pleased with the way it came out. You can tell just from holding it, it's thicker and heavier than the second edition. It's got a lot more in it. And it's got illustrations from Lydia, brand new illustrations from Lydia, in addition
Very cool.
to
Well, I would say, first of all, in theory, we all had time because we were locked down or whatever, but you got to factor in sort of I don't know what you want to call it, psycho-spiritual strain of the moment as well. And then compounded with you actually getting sick, that's a whole other thing. But I know when I spoke with Amy, she mentioned working on the third edition and some of the things that she wanted to have changed. Mm-hmm. And it's just so funny how the history of that book, there's always been this deadline. It's been hard to meet. Yeah. And it's always been a challenge because you wanted to address things that you seem to learn after they come out. Like the second edition addressed some things that happened with the first edition. And then it seemed like the third edition was trying to address a few more of the things that came out even after the second edition. A lot more of them.
Yeah. Look, if you write something down about your understanding of your field and just put it out there and then come back to it 10 years later and aren't absolutely horrified with what you were saying 10 years ago, then there'd be something wrong if you weren't. And we were just like, oh, I would never say it that way again. And so there was a major reworking of language and some stuff around pronouns, not to be politically correct, but just actually to make it more of a personal embodied kind of a writing, and
you said like your body rather than the body or whatever.
Yeah, the body or the diaphragm, right? Yeah. So I'm writing about the diaphragm in the breathing chapter. And it's like, well, no, it's your diaphragm. You have one. You're using it right now as you're reading this. And so it was all with this goal of making the experience of reading the book and absorbing the information as embodied as possible. Because we talk in the very beginning of the book with some of the new material about language, about the models we use when we're describing something like anatomy, and that anatomy is a story. It's a story that's told with a sharp instrument. That's what the word itself means. It means to cut up. And so, we actually cut up a little bit our ideas about anatomy in the book before we launch into the actual information and material, just to say, hey, this is a story we're telling, and these are the words and concepts that we're choosing to use. But keep in mind, this is this particular lens that we're looking through, and the subject of the body is such a vast and varied thing to be studying. What you come up with in that study is going to depend entirely on the lens that you're using. And that's been especially true for me. One of the focuses I've had since we last spoke, and one of the things that actually took us out of quarantine in 2020 was the cadaver lab. Lydia and I traveled to Colorado Springs to Gil Hedley's lab.
I got to talk to him. That was awesome. He's kind of a special guy.
Gil is one of my favorite humans currently walking the planet, as you can tell from having chatted with him. Yeah. So we were there, and actually I was attending the lab, but Lydia was producing the live stream for him. As you know, she's a very accomplished event producer.
I remember.
Because you were at the Jessica Char thing in 2018.
Compared notes in the past, if I recall.
Yeah. And so and that was quite an experience because that was the first time Gil had done a live stream. And he had like 1,000 people signed up who were logging in to view it. And that was really good preparation for a similar event that we produced in October of 2020 in San Diego at a lab there in conjunction with our friends at Soul of Yoga in Encinitas. And so we did our own cadaver lab, Lydia, myself, and Lori Nemitz. I think you've met Lori. She's a very accomplished dissector, and
I've met one time or another, I think. But
yeah, and so we did our own lab, and then we decided to create a business called KNM Labs, which is Kaminoff, Nemitz, Man. Me, Lori, and Lydia Labs, and we've actually done some events together since then. We were just in March in Colorado Springs doing another lab. And so that's one thing that I've been up to, and sort of finding innovative ways to integrate cadaver dissection into teaching about movement, teaching about breathing, and giving as rich an experience to the folks in the lab as possible.
So what is it? I mean, I've heard you talk about doing the dissection workshops with Gil for years. I remember Allison West talking about going to one of them, and
that was in '97. Yeah, that was the first one.
You guys have been doing that for a long time. What is it about?
No, I drove Allison to that lab every day.
That's probably the case. I don't doubt it.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, because you bring it up now, what is it that you think the dissection workshops bring? Is it just being able to see in that way how things happen and illustrate them better than the PowerPoint presentations or whatever? Or because people get to see it and in a more embodied way because you're standing right there looking at it? Is that what you think?
Well, it puts the anatomy in 3D reality for one thing. And every other way to study anatomy is a representation of the actuality of anatomy. That's at least several steps removed from how it exists in our bodies. A cadaver is a representation of anatomy as well, right? It's not living, obviously, but it's as close as you can get to the textures, the colors, the movement, because we these days we use largely unfixed cadavers, which means they're not embalmed, and so the quality of the fascial layers and the movement, the differential movement between the layers, I think one of the best ways I can describe the difference is going back to that lab you mentioned that Allison was at in what was it? It was 97 in New Jersey with Gil. It's sort of like you're meeting celebrities in person, and you've watched their movies, you've seen them on the big screen, you admire their work. Yeah. And then it was for me, it was oh, the psoas. I am such a fan of your work. It's so good to meet you in person, finally. You
don't look anything like I expected.
Yeah, sometimes you don't. And sometimes, it's disappointing. I just remember being disappointed in the quadratus lumborum. It just wasn't as substantial or significant as I had made it out in my head. Mm-hmm. But also, you understand how much of what you study in books or other media about anatomy is just an artifact of the scalpel. I was in that lab and I just wanted to see the inguinal ligament. It's a pretty reasonable desire for someone studying anatomy. So I go in where it's supposed to be, strung between the ASIS and the pubic bone. And, of course, the abdominal wall is there. It's somewhere under the abdominal wall, and I'm taking my scalpel and I'm taking off the layers of the abdominal wall and one at a time because there's a bunch of layers there. And finally, at the last layer, when I lift it up, expecting to see the inguinal ligament, it's not there. I'm like, what? Hey, Gil, come over here. This guy has no inguinal ligament. And he looks at what I did and he said, of course he doesn't. You just took it off. I was like, no, I was removing the abdominal wall. He was like, well, what do you think the inguinal ligament is? It's the bottom edge of the abdominal wall. That's all it is. When you see a drawing of it in the book, it means they just cut just above that edge, removed everything that didn't look like an inguinal ligament, and left the edge of the abdominal wall hanging between those two attachments. So he took the scalpel and he did exactly that on the other side and said, there, I just made an inguinal ligament for you. And that just blew my mind. It's like the inguinal ligament isn't a thing or a part in the body. It's the kind of rolled up edge of the abdominal wall strung between two attachments. And you can separate everything. You can decide to make it a separate thing,
but it doesn't exist without an abdominal wall, right?
Yeah. But just the concept of that, just in that one example of that concept had me rethink everything about anatomy, because it's like, wow, there aren't parts until you make parts with something sharp, and you divide this from that, and that's what anatomy is. And the experience of someone who teaches movement or yoga is much more about continuities and connections. Because we're always saying things like, can you feel the support for your diaphragm arising from the arches of your feet? Because we have that experience, that embodied experience of what that's like. And then when you go in and you find a continuity, like, for example, with Tom Meyer's deep front line, which sort of can be carved out of the rest of the body to show that, yes, there's a pathway there that's conducting that experience for you. It's like, oh, okay, so that's a model that we can sort of see and make happen in a cadaver that gives us a tangible connection to these experiences that we've been having. But it's just as much an artifact as the inguinal ligament, like people will often show up in our labs either with Gil or with Lori, because Lori worked for many, many years with anatomy trains with Tom Myers. And they'll say, like, okay, I want to see the deep front line. And Gil will say, sure, we just have to cut away everything that doesn't look like the deep front line. Or it's like, he'll say, oh, you want it? I can show you the Eiffel Tower in there if you want. I'll just carve away everything that doesn't look like the Eiffel Tower. It's like, what do you have in your head that you want to be looking at? And how are you going to use your scalpel to see it?
It makes me think that when I've studied with you and I've studied with Amy, because I've had the privilege of doing that with both of you, it seemed to me that one of the distinguishing things about what you were doing in terms of studying anatomy, and I want to say this is true, maybe even, although no, I don't want to say that. It was more directly true for you because you were referencing Desikachar and you were clearly utilizing the inquiry into anatomy and particularly the anatomy of breath, in my mind, to teach yoga principles. Like maybe it was in a roundabout way, but you certainly seemed to learn stuff from Desikachar, and you taught about the sthira and sukha of a cell and the breath patterns of.
Yeah, I wouldn't be honoring Desikachar if it wasn't roundabout, by the way, because he always took a roundabout route to the point, but that was his Socratic method of doing it to get you to think. He just spoon feed you the inquiry, So it was a roundabout way. So yes, I'm glad you used that word because that's very much honoring my teacher.
Well, I mean, again, I thought for me, being someone who was identifying as a yoga teacher, I don't know what that means, but like I was, and particularly inspired by that tradition, that teacher, people like you. And, compared to other people who studied with Desikachar and how it came through them. And I used to say, like, Desikachar taught different things to different people based on who they were. And then I've been corrected, I think, to say, no, he taught the same things. He just taught them differently depending on who people were.
The principles were the same. Yes.
Yeah. And so it seems to me that those principles aren't necessarily inherent to a study of anatomy, but they were one of the reasons why you were interested in anatomy, it seems like.
Yeah. Well, yes, I was interested in anatomy before I met Desikachar.
True.
And when I realized that he, in spite of the fact that he was a structural engineer, did not express the yogic teachings in anatomical terms, that sort of became my self-assigned task, was to use the lens of anatomy to look at yoga just as much as I was using the lens of yoga to look at anatomy. And in the end, it's the same topic. and the same principles arise, because you're looking at life. You're looking at how life works. You're looking at how successful living organisms are able to remain successful, which is by maintaining a balance of sthira and sukha, whether it's at the cellular level. As you mentioned, the sthira and sukha of the cell is basically the balance between, stability and permeability, and when you see that the most universal, timeless principles of yoga are the ones that arise from looking at life and how it operates, then it's very clearly the same topic. And that's been the really solid foundation that I've found that I can stand on as a teacher, as an educator, when I'm, working with folks. Because in the end, and this goes to something that we don't generally get to talk about, Jay, is when you get to the philosophical realm, and you're obviously deeply involved in that inquiry, and words like, dual and non-dual come up a lot in your discussions with the scholars.
You've been listening. I've been asking people about stuff.
No shit, Jay. I listen to the podcast. I know what's going on.
Cool.
And so for me, there's only one dual, non-dual conversation, and that has to do with whether you have a belief system that has this idea that the soul, the spirit, whatever you want to call it, can exist independently of the body or not. Because when you look at the Indian teachings, regardless of whether you call it dualistic or non-dualistic Vedanta or this or that, the common accepted assumption is that the soul is this entity that has this prior and post existence to the temporal, impermanent physical body, right? I don't have that belief. Jessica Char knew I didn't have that belief. I'm the most atheist person you'll ever meet, and non-mystical, because I don't have that belief, which means, and this is getting back to the anatomy, which means that I don't accept on faith the authority of the Vedas, right? Because the Vedas, if they're nothing, it doesn't matter how you want to interpret them. If you don't accept that they're Shruti, if you don't accept that these are channeled teachings that came from some other dimension of spirit to find their way into our physical world through the rishis, through being heard, literally Shruti, being heard by the rishis, if you don't accept that, you're outside that particular conversation. You're Nastika, you're, something else. You're not in the whole, we get to now argue over how to interpret the Vedas. You're basically saying, I don't believe the story of where you say that they came from, which I don't, right? Because I don't have this belief that there's a separate existence for the soul from the physical body.
Let me ask you a question about that. I
for me, that's non-dual. That's non-dual for me.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I guess the question I have about that is, I'm in agreement in many regards. And my ideas about duality have been evolving. I'll just say that, because I think I oversimplified things in the past. But I would say that when you say that, can you have a soul or a spirit separate from your body? On some level, I'm kind of in agreement with you. Like, my soul only has manifestation because I have a body or whatever. Like, there's a fundamental relationship there. But you're suggesting that there's no other aspect or consciousness that carries on, that this is it, that this experience that you're having of being in time space, once it's done, it's done. There's no another lifetime or reincarnation or any of that stuff.
Right. But yes, yeah, because you have to ask, well, where did it come from and where is it going to go once the body's no longer here? And I say nowhere and nowhere on both ends of that question. Because I'd say one of the most shattering philosophical statements I ever heard in my life was that humans are beings of self-made soul, that we actually generate over the course of our lives through the choices of focus that we make, our soul, which means that it's not on loan from some larger cloud of consciousness or some deity. It's not on its way to a better place than here. It's ours and ours alone. And with all the responsibility that implies about those choices we've made. And I've gotten in trouble for this, as you know, because when you take that into very specific conversations, some of which are very contentious in our yoga world, it really does go into this idea that we have free will. We have actual free will. It's conditioned and it's challenged by all the things we didn't choose, our nature and our nurture, and yet we still make choices. So, by even saying that, I have been accused of being a victim blamer, which of course I'm not, but for many people that's the, a bright line when you make a statement like that. It's like, so you're saying that, this person chose to be abused or whatever. And it's not that simple. But agency, the whole idea that we have agency is really at the root of this free will discussion. And there's some very smart people in the world who I respect in many regards for their smartness, who I think are very not smart when it comes to free will, because they believe it doesn't exist or it's an illusion. I don't. So,
well, I appreciate that, and I'm in some agreement with you. Again, I agree in the unknown on both sides, but I don't think that means there's no magic or spirit. And I think that there's a lot of case when you look at nature, that and you look at the human body and what happens in the human body. There's a lot of reason to think there's wonder and mystery to this experience.
I'm all for wonder and mystery. I mean, and I'm all for spirit. I mean, spirit is breath, right? Yeah. That's where the word comes from. And so you can be a non-mystical, non-religious, atheistic prick like me, and people point to it and say, you're not spiritual, but that's different. Spiritual is different.
I agree. What I would say is, and it's something I was just talking about with a group of teachers the other night. What I hear you doing is sort of sloughing off a whole bunch of formalities, and even these conversations I've been having around duality and non-duality. I think I'm kind of done with them on some level. In one regard, because it's the naming of it that is problematic. And coming back to Desikachar and how he taught, I was just looking at Patanjali's Yoga Sutras with people, and it seems to me the way that Desikachar taught sutras was different than a lot of other people that I've seen. He even specifically had this quote that was about how it wasn't about trying to translate all the words, that teachers use them more as mnemonic devices in a similar way that asana was used, that it was more about what a person gets from it or what the experience is or the relationship that's happening between you in the exchange of it than the thing itself almost.
Oh, absolutely. No, he was very explicit in that he would quote his father as saying, Krishnamacharya would say that the sutra form is not intended to be instruction to the student, it's inspiration to the teacher. That was the exact quote, as I recall, Desikachar using when he expressed exactly the thing that you were saying. It's the teachings are not in the sutras are there to anchor your memory of what the teachings were that you received from your teacher. And you could see him doing that as he was teaching, because there'd be this whole roundabout Socratic inquiry that involved, some practice and some breathing and a focus of meditation and a discussion and questions and answers. But it was all clearly anchored by like a key thought or teaching that was attached to a particular sutra. And you'd only eventually figure out which sutra it was when you understood the teaching, and for me, that's a tremendously challenging model as an educator to live up to, because it's so much harder to do that than to simply give someone, the sutra, this is what it's about, and this is the rule it's laying down for your life, which I find very uninteresting.
And it challenges sort of existing expectations and stuff. That's one of the things that I had to really tackle with doing this training, is that it was very important that people enter into it with a clear idea about what we're doing together. And the idea of this being a co-creative knowledge building thing, not I have all the information and I'm just going to give you the information that you paid for or whatever.
Yeah, no, I used to do that. I mean, I used to think that's what teaching was. It was sort of like, I'm at the front of the room and I'm holding this big hose of information. I'm going to spray you with it. And hopefully some of it will absorb into whatever open spaces you have in your psyche. And there's a real limitation.
Wait, I can interrupt for a second. Part of that is context. And I know you know how important context is in these matters. When you show up, when you're a traveling teacher, like we were talking about before, you show up in a room with 40 or 60 people you've never met before, all going, hey, is this going to be worth the money I spent? You kind of adopt the hose metaphor in a way to try to ingratiate people. You know what I mean? There's a certain thing that you have to do. You have to put on a bit of a show in that context. That's different than when you're in the lab with Gil with 3 tables of people or whatever,
Yeah, sure. Well, Gil will frequently, say, what's this? Gil will say, I don't know. And he's looking right at something he's dissected probably 400 times. Like, I don't know. What is it? Where does it go? What's it attached to? What does it seem to do? Oh yeah, that's the left branch of the subpulmonary blippity blop or whatever. But but starting with I don't know doesn't mean you don't know your subject. It just means that you understand that there's the need for an inquiry in any kind of learning environment, and that's something that I've in the last few years have been getting so much clearer on. Particularly because so much of what I've been doing has been over Zoom, and like, how do you generate a learning environment in that format, which I believe has certain advantages for many people in terms of agency. We're talking about agency, how much easier is it to click the red button than it is to roll up your mat and walk out of a room if you don't like what's happening,
I mean,
or just turn off your camera. You don't have to leave the Zoom. You just turn off your camera, right?
Yeah. I mean, in some regards, it's made things more. There's less filler time. You know what I mean? Like
more break time.
Long teacher training sessions that people were doing to fill the 200 fucking hours or whatever. Now it's you know what I mean? Yeah. And I think if there's some people, not everybody's doing it, but I imagine you are as well, are finding, okay, how do I use this medium? What are the parts that want to be live meetings? What are the parts that can be pre-recorded and watched on their own time? And how do those things work together to give someone a whole experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really grateful that Kelsey and I put the .NET courses up like 12 years ago. So, we've been...
Remember.
Yeah. Well, you're in the.
I was using that
room when the cameras were on.
That one. I was when you filmed it, but I used the foundations course in my training for years.
And so we were aware from having produced those and the feedback we were getting all along that there are tremendous advantages to simply being able to hit pause and go to the bathroom and not miss anything, or rewind it, or fast forward, or skip to the thing the topic that is on your mind right now. And that's all with pre-recorded stuff, and then transcripts, being able to look at the printed transcripts, because some people absorb better when they're looking at the printed word. And it's interesting now that I'm mentioning that, because I did want to bring it up. The main thing I'm working on now is another online platform. And
I heard you on what's her name's podcast last month. Forgive me. Shira Cohen, that's right. Thank you. I wanted to shout her out because I listened to it. It was good. And I was intrigued. You're going to start a podcast, I heard. And
I am. I've already recorded a couple of episodes. I want to say one other thing, because this is one thing I wanted to get to, because it seems like the feature of this new show or this new thing you're doing has to do with one-to-one work. Yeah, Clinical Corner. Yeah. It's people who, like me, have skill and experience in working one-on-one with people. In other words, creating a window into something you would ordinarily never, ever get to see. And that's a private session. And it occurred to me, there's actually a lot of video of those sessions now in the world because people have been doing this over Zoom for a couple of years. And as long as all the permissions and releases are there to share it, what I get to do in the podcast, the premium access to the podcast. In other words, it's like a 2-hour thing. The first hour is like what we're doing here. That's open to anyone. It's free and all that. But then the people who sign up for a mere pittance, a minimal fee, will
You're
get
going to have
access
to
to the
explain these
premium
things
content.
to me, Leslie.
Well, hey, man, you figured this stuff out before a lot of people.
Hey, you know what I want to say
you
to
and
you,
Josh figured it out.
This is a really great idea for you, and I'm glad you're doing it because you know what it is? It is your Wednesday nights. I used to go to those Wednesday night sessions where people would sign up to have a one-to-one session with you in front of people, and we got to watch. Well, guess what?
We have that footage now. We never did anything with that footage. I have all of that unedited 2-camera footage of me working with people in clinic that we are now starting to do post-production on, and that will be part of what I upload to this platform. Not just the footage, but me commenting on the footage from 10 years in the future, right? So, but that's what I get to do with my guests on the podcast. Like, for example, I did an interview with Robin Rothenberg, who does essential yoga therapy and helped me a lot, by the way, with my post-COVID stuff, because she does some amazing, really good stuff with breathing that just reminded me of some of the simple things I could be doing for my own breath, which, by the way, just an aside, I realized how valuable my training in breathing was when I had COVID, because I had to completely recalibrate how I was breathing on a moment-to-moment basis. If I breathe too deeply, like my normal, full breathing that I'm able to do, when I had COVID, I would go into uncontrollable coughing. If I breathe too shallowly, I'd immediately be overwhelmed by a sense of suffocation and panic. And I could see how people without the background and experience in their own breathing with the same exact symptoms as mine could end up in a lot of trouble really, really quickly and like be in the hospital and intubated and maybe even perish. And so I was really, really grateful for that. And yet with some of the longer term effects, the little tickle in the throat that makes you want to cough and all of that, when Robin heard that I had the long COVID, she very generously offered to do a session with me on Zoom. And it was very, very helpful. And that's the session that we review in my podcast with Robin.
Oh, with you. That's great. That you're the subject. Perfect.
Yeah. And the other one that I have in the can so far is with Libby Hinesley, who is coming out with the Yoga for Bendy People. So it's all about hypermobility. She's a PT who has Ehlers-Danlos hypermobility syndrome and specializes in working with people. And so we actually had her demonstrating on her own hypermobile body some of the assessment and some of the things that she takes her clients through and commenting on it as we go along. But the more typical session in my podcast will be like, for example, if you have a video of you working one-on-one with someone, we'll watch it together on Zoom and not pause it every so often or jump to the more interesting parts and just talk about what you were thinking. Why did you make this choice? What led you to make this adaptation for that person? So it's really getting into the nuts and bolts of the process of what we go through as educators or yoga therapists when we're working one-on-one with someone. And this is opening a window into a world that I think a lot of people are going to want to experience and learn from.
Well, so let me ask you about one of those, because I don't know if you remember this, like one of those Wednesday nights that you did had an indelible mark on me. I don't know if you remember it. Maybe you know. I'm sure you do. There was a woman you were working with who came into one of those Wednesday nights. She had, I can't remember, she had some trauma to her lungs, maybe like only one of her lungs, or she had one of her lungs was diminished, but she had lots of problems with her lungs. And when she came in the room, like her ability to move was very limited, even to sit. You had worked with her for a long time. You put her on a table and I witnessed you do a series of things that were like very shocking to observe. But
Yeah.
at the time, like I kind of had an idea about what you were doing because I understood because I'd been studying with you about breath and what you were doing.
Yeah.
But what was unbelievable is when she got up off of the table, like I was in tears. It was so profound what I witnessed.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
So that when you say what those choices were, I have to ask you, do you remember the session? It looks like you do. Can you say something about it and what you did in that session?
Yeah. Well, sure. But that's a bit of the work I do that's a little more unusual compared to other people that do what they call yoga therapy, because I have such a background in body work and hands-on work. And so a lot of the ways I work with breathing are very hands-on. And with this person in particular, what had to happen for her, because she had so much damage and so many symptoms, what had to happen for her was almost to let her go into the respiratory distress of hyperventilation, which resulted, if it's a session I think you're describing, in just a very brief moment of syncope where she actually passed out for a moment. And in that moment, her nervous system kind of reset. And a lot of the struggle that she experienced on a moment-to-moment basis to keep her body oxygenated could let go. And then the diaphragm actually was able to fire and do its thing. And all the accessory tension that she was using was able to be a lot less. And of course, it would affect her posture, her voice, her everything. And was that session on a bodywork table, or was it in a chair?
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.